had been feeling burnt out for months. Work was nonstop, my phone never stopped buzzing, and even on weekends I couldn't relax. I needed a break, not just a weekend off. I needed to be completely alone, away from the city, somewhere I could breathe. I remembered this old cabin my uncle had owned deep in the woods of northern Oregon. He passed away years ago, and the place hadn't been used much since. It wasn't listed on any rental site, just a quiet, rundown structure tucked behind a patch of private forest that no one really visited. I managed to get the keys from my cousin, who warned me it hadn't been checked in a long time. I didn't care. I wanted solitude, no cell signal, no people, no noise, just trees, fresh air, and time to clear my head. I drove up on a Tuesday morning in late September. The highway gave way to cracked, narrow roads, then finally to dirt paths riddled with rocks and overgrown grass. My tires kicked up a thick cloud of dust as I made my way down the final stretch. The cabin appeared slowly behind a bend, wooden, weathered, and smaller than I remembered. The roof looked intact, though faded and streaked with moss. One of the window shutters hung crooked. Still, it stood. I parked a few feet away, killed the engine, and listened. No cars, no people, just wind moving through the trees. I hauled my bag inside and looked around. The air smelled like dry wood, old dust, and a faint scent of pine. There was a single room with a bed, a small kitchen area with a rusty sink, and an old wood stove. I opened the windows to air it out, then checked the back door, which led to a small deck overlooking a slope of trees. The view was perfect, nothing but forest stretching far into the hills. I hadn't brought much, just food, water, a first aid kit, matches, and a flashlight. No laptop, no phone. I left my phone in the glove compartment on purpose. The first day passed in silence. I walked around, gathering small branches and stacking them neatly under the porch. I checked the inside of the cabin for mice or anything that needed to be cleaned. Just some old leaves and dust. I found an axe in the shed and split a few logs until my arms felt sore. I ate some bread and fruit, then sat on the deck and watched the sky turn orange, then deep blue. The quiet was almost unsettling at first, like my brain couldn't process the lack of noise. But I liked it. That night, I laid in the bed and listened. Creaked a little, but it held. I heard branches brushing against the roof, some animal rustling through the brush outside. Normal sounds. I stared at the ceiling for hours, not really tired, just adjusting. There was no electricity, so I used a battery lantern until I drifted off. The next morning, I woke up early. The sun barely pierced the mist outside. I made some coffee over a tiny gas burner I'd brought and sat on the deck with a blanket over my shoulders. The air felt colder than I expected. I made a mental note to gather more firewood. After eating, I decided to hike down the slope behind the cabin. The trail wasn't official, just a worn footpath my uncle must have used years ago. It led down through heavy trees and soft moss-covered ground. I kept going for about an hour, just enjoying the sounds of birds and leaves. Eventually, I stopped at a small stream. I sat down and splashed some water on my face. Felt good to be disconnected. I was about to head back when I noticed something half-buried near a fallen log. It looked like an old tarp or canvas, partially hidden under dirt and leaves. I dug around it with a stick. Underneath was a rusted metal box. Nothing fancy, just a beat-up toolbox with one hinge broken. I pried it open. Inside were random things: an old hunting knife, a soaked notebook with pages stuck together, a broken pair of sunglasses, and a few bullet casings. It looked like someone had stashed it there years ago and forgotten about it. I flipped through the notebook. Most of the writing was ruined by water, but I could make out a few words here and there, dates, numbers, some short notes. It didn't seem important, but something about the way it was hidden felt strange. Not like someone accidentally left it there, like they didn't want it found. I decided to take it back with me. Back at the cabin, I left the box on the table and started a small fire outside to cook dinner. That night, while lying in bed, I kept thinking about the notebook. Why stash it? Why hide it under a tarp in the middle of nowhere? The entries didn't say much, but one page near the middle was clearer than the others. It said, "Stay away from the ridge. Marked the trees. Then a date, August 18th, 2003. That stuck in my head. The ridge. I remembered the hill north of the cabin, steeper than the others with taller trees. I hadn't gone that way yet. I made a plan to hike there the next morning. I set out early. The path to the ridge was thick with underbrush, and I had to use the knife from the box to cut through some brambles. The air felt different, heavier. The trees got denser the closer I got to the base. Then I saw the first marked tree, a large pine with a deep X carved into the bark. The cut looked old, weathered, not fresh. I looked around and saw another tree maybe 20 feet away with the same mark. Then another. The marks formed a line curving up the slope. I followed them, climbing carefully. The soil was loose in some areas, and I had to catch myself a few times. Eventually, I reached a flat area near the top where the trees thinned out. In the middle was a large stone, almost like a table. It didn't look natural. Someone had placed it there. Moss covered most of it, but I could see old stains on the surface, dark, brown, dried out. Animal blood, maybe. I looked around and found more bullet casings nearby, along with a coil of rusted wire. I stood there for a while, not sure what I was looking at. Some kind of hunting spot? A place where someone skinned deer? But why mark the trees? And why leave that warning in the notebook? I didn't stay long. Something about the area made my skin crawl. I backed away and made my way down the hill fast, taking a different path to avoid the marked trees. Back at the cabin, I locked the door, even though I was in the middle of nowhere. I didn't sleep well. I kept thinking I heard footsteps outside, twigs snapping, a low rustle just beyond the window. I told myself it was just my mind messing with me, just animals, but the unease stayed. The next day, I didn't explore. I stayed near the cabin, chopped wood, cleaned the stove, anything to keep busy. I didn't look at the box or the notebook again. But that night, as I sat in the dark with only the lantern glowing, I heard something that wasn't an animal. A sharp thud, like a rock hitting wood. Then another. Not fast, not random, slow, spaced out, deliberate. I turned off the lantern and sat still, heart pounding. I stared at the window, but it was too dark to see anything. The sounds stopped after a few minutes. I stayed awake until dawn. That morning, I found 3 small rocks placed neatly on the front steps. Clean, smooth, different from the dirt and gravel around the cabin. Someone had put them there. I packed my stuff in less than an hour. I left most of the food and supplies. I didn't care. I got in the car and drove back the same way I came, glancing in the mirror every few minutes. I didn't tell anyone what happened. I didn't report anything because nothing really happened. Just noises, markings, old tools, and a creepy notebook. But I knew someone had been out there. Someone who wanted that area to stay hidden. Maybe a hunter. Maybe someone who did things they didn't want seen. Maybe it was nothing, but I trusted my gut. Something about that ridge wasn't right. I never went back. A few months later, I saw a small news story buried in the back pages of a local paper. A hiker had gone missing in that forest. They found his backpack near the ridge, but not him. No foul play confirmed. Just another disappearance. I never forgot the notebook. I never forgot the marks on those trees. I still think about that stone at the top of the hill and the way the forest felt different up there. I wanted quiet, I wanted peace. I found it, but it came with something else. I learned that some places are quiet for a reason. Some parts of the woods aren't meant to be found. I rented a small off-grid cabin in northern Minnesota for a week last fall. I was burned out from work and just needed space. Real space. The kind of space where you can't hear anything except wind and leaves and the occasional rustle of an animal. I found the cabin through a lesser-known rental site. It wasn't fancy, just one room, a small kitchenette, a wood stove, and an outhouse maybe 20 yards away. No Wi-Fi, no phone signal. That was the point. I wanted out, and this place was out. The owner left the key under a flat rock near the front steps, just like he said he would. The place was surrounded by thick woods. It sat on a slight hill that sloped down into a patch of swampy land and then a stretch of pine forest beyond. The nearest paved road was about 6 miles out, and you had to take a narrow dirt trail to get there. I barely made it in my Subaru. It bottomed out twice, but the cabin itself was intact, even if it was weather-worn and kind of leaning to one side. The roof didn't leak, and the door shut tight. That's all I needed. The first night was peaceful. I cooked canned chili on the small gas stove and listened to the wind pushing through the trees. There were so many stars outside, more than I'd seen in years. I sat on the front steps for almost an hour just staring at them, wrapped in a thick hoodie and listening to distant owls calling each other. When I finally went to bed, the silence was so complete that it took me a long time to fall asleep. I kept hearing little things, branches tapping, tiny rustlings, but that's nature. I eventually drifted off. The second day, I spent exploring the woods behind the cabin. I followed a narrow game trail for about an hour, taking photos and keeping track of my direction. I found an old deer stand nailed up into a tree about 12 feet off the ground. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. The ladder rungs were rotting. A rusted thermos sat up on the platform. I left it alone and kept walking. Around midday, I turned back. I didn't want to push too far and get lost. The trail was starting to fade, and even though I had a compass and a GPS watch, it still made me uneasy. Back at the cabin, I made some coffee and sat near the wood stove as the sun dipped lower. Around 6 or so, I heard what sounded like something heavy walking through the brush out behind the cabin. I froze for a second and then got up and looked out the back window. Nothing. Probably a deer. Could have even been a bear, but they usually stayed clear of people. I didn't go out to check. That night, I had trouble sleeping again. I kept waking up, and each time I felt more on edge. There was a low creaking noise from the back wall of the cabin. It wasn't wind. It sounded more like something lightly pressing or brushing against the wall. I held my breath, staring into the darkness, listening. The sound would stop for a while, then come back, then stop again. I finally got up, pulled on my boots, and stepped outside with my flashlight. I walked all the way around the cabin. Nothing. No prints, no sign of anything. I figured maybe it was an animal trying to scratch or chew at the wood. I knocked on the wall to scare anything off and went back inside. Locked the door. I told myself I was just letting my imagination get the best of me. The next morning, I found a faint boot print in the mud about 20 feet from the back of the cabin. It wasn't mine. Mine had a distinct tread pattern. This one was flatter, more worn out like an old work boot. I crouched and looked at it for a long time. It was pointing toward the cabin, not away. I looked around and didn't see any more. The ground was mostly covered in dry pine needles, so there wouldn't be clear prints unless it rained. I told myself maybe it was old, maybe from the owner or another renter. Still, it bothered me. That afternoon, I walked back to the deer stand. I don't know why, but I felt like I had to. I climbed up it this time, testing each step carefully. The wood was cracked but held. From up there, I could see the tops of the trees stretching for miles. It was quiet, too quiet. After a few minutes, I climbed down and started heading back. I kept looking behind me. I didn't hear anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, that something was different. Back at the cabin, I checked all the windows. Locked. Door locked. I even dragged the small table in front of the door just for peace of mind. I didn't light the lantern that night, just used a flashlight and kept it pointed low. I stayed awake for hours, sitting on the bed with my back against the wall. I kept hearing that soft brushing sound again from the back of the cabin. At one point, it was rhythmic, like slow dragging. I didn't go outside this time. I just sat there holding the hatchet I'd brought for chopping wood. My heart was pounding the entire time. At some point, I dozed off from sheer exhaustion. When I woke up, it was just starting to get light outside. I got dressed, stepped outside, and immediately noticed something was off. The outhouse door was wide open. I always shut it. I walked over, looked inside. Nothing, but the smell was stronger than usual, like something had been in there disturbing it. Around the edges of the door frame were fresh scratches, thin and horizontal like from fingernails or maybe a knife. I looked closer, there were at least 8 or 9 of them. Not animal scratches. These were deliberate. I packed my bag right then. I had planned to stay a week, But it was day 4, and I'd had enough. I didn't even eat breakfast. I stuffed everything into my pack, threw it in the car, and started driving. The dirt trail out felt even narrower than before. The trees seemed to crowd in tighter. At one point, I thought I saw someone standing far off in the woods, just between 2 trees, but when I looked again, they were gone. Could have been a trick of the light. I made it to the paved road around noon. I drove straight to a gas station with a strong cell signal and called the cabin owner. He didn't pick up. I left a message saying I'd left early and that something felt off about the place. I didn't go into detail. I didn't think he'd believe me. I went back home and tried to forget about it. But a week later, I got a text from an unknown number. It said only one thing: "You made the right choice." I stared at it for a long time. I never replied. I blocked the number and deleted the message. I didn't recognize the area code, and I've never given out that number to anyone except family and work. A few days after that, I searched for the cabin listing online. It was gone. The whole rental site account had been removed. I even tried looking up the coordinates from an old screenshot. The satellite view showed the cabin still there, but the woods around it were different, somehow more overgrown than I remembered. Like no one had touched it in years. I don't know who was out there with me. I don't know how long they'd been watching or why they didn't do anything worse. Maybe they were just trying to scare me off. If that was the case, it worked. I never went back, and I never will. All I know is that someone had been there. The boot print wasn't mine. The scratches weren't from animals. And that message wasn't random. Someone was out there, and I think they were used to being alone in that place. Maybe I had intruded on their space. Maybe I got lucky. Either way, I left just in time. That week changed the way I think about being alone. I still go on solo trips, but never without cell service, and never anywhere I can't leave in under 10 minutes. I carry a firearm now, and I tell people exactly where I'm going and when I'll be back. Because out there in the woods, you're not always alone, even when you think you are. I rented the cabin because I needed a break. That was it. I wasn't trying to run from anything or anyone. Life had just been too loud, too fast, and too heavy for a while. Work had gotten ridiculous with the long hours and endless video calls. My apartment in the city felt more like a storage closet than a home. So I took 2 weeks off in early October, found a cabin online that looked private enough, and booked it. It was just outside a little place called Millerton in northern Vermont. From the pictures, it looked clean and simple. Wooden walls, a stone fireplace, a decent-sized kitchen, and a small porch looking out over some trees. I didn't want anything fancy. I just wanted quiet. I drove up early on a Monday morning. Took about 6 hours from where I lived in Hartford. The roads got narrower the farther I drove, and the last stretch was a dirt road that twisted through a thick patch of woods. There were no houses nearby that I could see. That was a good sign to me. No cars driving by. No one blasting music. Just trees, birds, and me. When I pulled up to the cabin, it was exactly what I expected. The place sat on a little clearing, surrounded on all sides by woods. There was a gravel patch to park on, and a short set of steps led up to the porch. The air smelled like pine and cold leaves. The wind was light but steady, moving through the trees like soft whispering. I didn't feel uneasy, just tired and ready to shut off. I unpacked the car, brought in my bags and groceries, then took a slow walk around the cabin. There wasn't much to it. The porch was sturdy, with an old bench and a small stack of firewood. Around back, there was a little shed with a padlock on it. I didn't have the key and didn't care to look inside. The back of the cabin faced more woods, thicker here, with ferns and fallen limbs all tangled together. There was no fence or trail, just trees and more trees. Inside, the place was clean and smelled faintly like cedar. There was a small living room with a couch and an old recliner. A short hallway led to a bedroom, a bathroom, and a little office with a desk and a chair. The kitchen had everything I needed: a fridge, stove, sink, and a cabinet stocked with mismatched plates and mugs. There was even a working coffee pot. The fridge was empty except for a box of baking soda and a few expired condiment packets, which I tossed. I settled in fast. By sunset, I had a fire going in the fireplace and a frozen pizza in the oven. I didn't bother turning on the TV. I just sat in the recliner, ate dinner off a paper plate, and listened to the fire crackle. Outside, the woods had gone quiet. That's something that takes getting used to. During the day, you hear birds and insects, but at night, it goes dead silent, like the trees are holding their breath. The first 2 days were peaceful. I read a few books I brought, took short hikes around the area, and made simple meals. I didn't see anyone. Not a hiker, not a ranger, not even a parked car. The only signs of other people were a few distant contrails overhead and one faint engine rumble way off through the trees. I started sleeping better, too. I hadn't realized how tense my body had been until I finally let go of it. But on the third night, I heard something that didn't fit. It was about 1 in the morning, and I'd just woken up to use the bathroom. I wasn't groggy or dreaming. I was fully awake. As I finished washing my hands, I heard it. A thud, not loud but clear, came from outside. I froze and listened. Another thud, then a pause, then something that sounded like scraping, metal on wood or something heavy being dragged across a surface. I walked quietly to the front window and looked out, trying to let my eyes adjust to the moonlight. The trees were still. The clearing was empty. Then one more sound, short, sharp, like a knock. I stood there for a long time just listening, but nothing else happened. After a while, I convinced myself it was probably a branch that had fallen, or maybe a raccoon had knocked something over. Still, I locked the doors and windows, then went back to bed. My heart didn't slow down for an hour. The next morning, I checked around the cabin. There were no branches on the porch or the roof. Nothing had fallen. The firewood stack was undisturbed. I circled to the back and noticed something that made me stop. The shed's padlock was gone. It wasn't broken. It wasn't hanging open. It was just gone. The door to the shed was still closed, but now it was only held shut by a rusty hook latch at the top. That latch didn't look like it could stop a strong wind, let alone a person. I didn't open it. I don't know why. Maybe I didn't want to find out what was inside, or maybe I already knew I wouldn't like it. I spent the rest of the day indoors. I made myself stay calm, made lunch, read for a while, and tried to nap, but I kept thinking about the lock. I hadn't touched it, and I hadn't seen anyone around. Could someone have come at night? Maybe a local? Someone checking on the place? That didn't make sense, though. Why not knock? Why not say something? When it got dark, I closed every curtain and turned off most of the lights. I sat in the recliner with a blanket over me and a kitchen knife tucked under a magazine on the side table. I felt stupid, but I wasn't going to sleep through the night again without something to grab. Nothing happened that night. Not one noise, not one movement, but I barely slept. The next morning, I went straight out to the shed. The hook was still latched. I opened it slowly and pulled the door open. Creaked. Inside, it was dusty and dim, with a sliver of light coming through a cracked board in the wall. There wasn't much in there. A rusted snow shovel, a few cracked plastic bins, and a half-empty bag of potting soil. That was it. Nothing that explained the missing lock. No animals. No signs of anyone living in there. I left it open and walked back inside, still feeling like I'd missed something. I started to keep track of things after that. I took pictures of the shed door each morning, wrote down what I did during the day, and checked the doors and windows every few hours. I felt crazy doing it, but I needed to know if anything changed. 3 days passed with nothing strange. The woods stayed quiet. The shed door never moved. I started to relax again. I even started planning a short hike down an old trail I'd found the first day. That night, I went to bed early, just after sunset. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of footsteps. They weren't loud, but they were unmistakable. Slow, steady, crunching on the gravel outside. They stopped for a moment, then moved again, closer this time. I held my breath and sat up in bed, listening hard. The footsteps circled to the back of the cabin. Then I heard another sound, something lighter, a creak. It was the shed door. I climbed out of bed and moved to the bedroom window. I couldn't see much, but I stayed there for a long time, watching. No one came into view. I didn't hear the door close. I waited until the sky started to get lighter before I stepped outside. The shed door was wide open. Inside, nothing looked disturbed, but I noticed something different this time. There were fresh footprints in the dirt just inside the door. Not boot prints, sneakers, maybe. The tread was faint, but they were definitely new. I backed out, locked the front door behind me, and sat down on the floor with my back to it. I thought about leaving. I should have left, but I kept telling myself I'd be gone in 4 days anyway. I didn't want to call the cops and say, "What? Someone opened a shed?" There was no damage, no theft. Nothing had happened to me, but that night something did. Just after midnight, I was reading on the couch when I heard the back door handle rattle. It wasn't wind. It wasn't subtle. Someone tried it once, paused, then again, harder. I grabbed the kitchen knife and stood frozen, staring at the door. I heard footsteps retreat. A minute later, the front door handle moved. Then nothing. I stayed up all night, knife in hand, lights off, peeking through curtains. I never saw anyone. At dawn, I walked the perimeter again. No footprints, no damage. The shed was shut this time. That morning, I packed everything. I wasn't waiting anymore. I loaded my car and locked the cabin behind me. As I drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror again and again. Nothing followed me. Nothing moved in the trees. I drove straight to a motel in town and slept there, door bolted, chair under the knob. The next morning, I called the rental agency and told them I left early. Didn't give a reason. I never heard back. A week later, back home, I couldn't stop thinking about that cabin. I pulled up the listing online, but it was gone. Deleted. The host's account wasn't even active anymore. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted, but I know they were real. They walked around that cabin, they watched it, and they tried the doors. I think they were waiting for something. Maybe just a mistake. Maybe for me to leave one door unlocked, one window cracked open. I'm careful now. I double lock everything. I don't stay in remote places anymore. I don't go where I can't see neighbors or hear cars. I've never felt safe the same way. The moment I drove away from the city and onto the narrow, twisting road that led into the forest, I could feel the noise and rush of everyday life fading behind me. The trees grew thick on both sides of the road, their branches arching overhead like a green tunnel. The late afternoon sun filtered through the leaves, casting dappled light onto the asphalt. I was heading to a cabin I had rented for the weekend, a place I'd never been before but had found online during a long, stressful week at work. I didn't want crowds, I didn't want noise. I just wanted to get away and be alone with nature. The GPS gave me clear directions, but the last few miles were over a rough dirt path that jutted deep into the woods. My small car bumped and rattled on the uneven surface. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, eyes fixed on the narrow road ahead, surrounded by thick pines and oaks that seemed to press closer with every turn. The smell of pine needles mixed with damp earth filled the air through the cracked windows. As the sun dipped lower, the shadows stretched long and the forest darkened. When I finally saw the cabin, it was a small wooden structure sitting in a clearing. It looked old but well kept, with a sloped roof and a small porch. A stack of firewood was neatly piled by the side. The windows were dark, reflecting the deepening sky. I parked and stepped out, the silence around me so complete it felt strange. No cars, no distant voices, just the soft rustling of leaves and occasional bird calls. I had no cell signal here, and honestly, I welcomed the disconnection. The air was cool and fresh, carrying the faint scent of moss and wood smoke. I took my backpack and walked up the steps onto the porch, feeling the rough wood under my boots. I opened the door, and inside the cabin smelled like dry wood and old blankets. It was small but cozy, with a simple kitchen area, a table, a bed in the corner, and a wood stove. A few cans of food and bottles of water sat on the shelves. The place had basic electricity powered by a generator, but I wasn't expecting to use much. I wanted this to be a break from screens and constant connectivity. I unpacked my things slowly, setting my clothes in the small closet and putting my food in the old-fashioned fridge. Outside, The sky was turning deep blue, the first stars beginning to show. I built a fire in the stove, feeling the warmth spread through the room as the flames crackled and popped. The cabin was quiet except for the sounds of the fire and the occasional creak of the wood settling. I found an old book on the shelf and sat near the stove, reading by the flickering light. Night came fully fast. The wind whispered through the trees outside, carrying a chill that made me pull my sweater tighter around me. I shut the windows and double-checked the locks on the door. Even though the cabin felt safe, a part of me was aware I was truly alone. I thought about the drive-in, how remote the place was, and how far I was from anyone who could help if something went wrong. I didn't sleep well that first night. Every little sound outside, branches snapping, the occasional rustle of an animal in the bushes, made me tense. The moon was full and cast silvery light through the window, making shadows on the walls. I kept imagining someone or something watching from just beyond the tree line, though I knew it was just my mind playing tricks. The isolation was heavy. Morning came slow and gray, the sky thick with clouds that muted the light. I brewed coffee on the small stove and stepped outside to stretch. The air was damp, and the ground covered with fallen leaves and pine needles. I looked around the clearing, the trees standing tall and silent. I planned to hike a bit today, so I packed a small bag with water, snacks, and a flashlight. I didn't want to wander too far. I wasn't familiar with the forest, and the thick underbrush made it easy to get lost. As I walked, the forest around me felt alive in a way that was both beautiful and unsettling. Birds called overhead, insects buzzed, and small animals darted in the brush. But there was also a deep stillness that felt almost too quiet. The trees grew closer together in places, their trunks thick and rough. The ground was uneven, littered with roots and stones. I kept my eyes on the path I was following, occasionally glancing behind me to check my route. After about an hour, I reached a small creek. The water was clear and cold, running over smooth stones with a gentle murmur. I knelt down and cupped my hands to drink, feeling the chill bite into my skin. The forest around the creek was thicker, the canopy closing overhead and blocking much of the sky. The air smelled fresher here, mixed with wet earth and the faint scent of decaying leaves. I stood and took a deep breath, trying to shake the uneasy feeling that had started to creep in. On the way back to the cabin, I thought about how isolated I really was. No cell phone, no other people around, no nearby roads. If something happened, if I got hurt or lost, there was no one to call for help. That thought lingered in the back of my mind like a shadow. I quickened my pace, eager to get back before dark. Back at the cabin, I prepared a simple meal and settled near the fire again. The wind had picked up outside, rattling the windows and making the branches scrape against the roof. I double-checked the door locks once more. The sounds of the forest at night were louder now. Owls hooting, the distant cry of some animal, the snap of twigs. I told myself I was just hearing normal forest noises, but a knot had formed in my stomach. That night, as I lay on the creaky bed, I heard footsteps outside. Soft, slow steps moving around the cabin. I froze, heart pounding. I stayed still and listened. The footsteps stopped, then something brushed against the porch railing. I held my breath, every muscle tense. After a long moment, the sounds faded into the wind. I convinced myself it was probably a deer or some other animal. Still, sleep came fitfully. The next morning, I found a small pile of broken branches and disturbed leaves just outside the cabin door, like something had been trying to make a path or scratch at the wood. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. I looked around but saw no footprints, no clear signs of any animal or person. It was as if whatever had been there was careful not to leave a trace. I spent the day trying to keep my mind busy. I cleaned the cabin a bit, gathered more firewood, and made notes in a journal I had brought along. But every time I looked out the window, I felt eyes watching from the trees. The forest was alive in a way I hadn't expected, unpredictable and dark beneath its quiet surface. As the sun began to set again, I decided to take extra precautions. I set up a few makeshift alarms, strings tied to cans that would clang if disturbed, and kept a heavy stick by the door. I knew I wasn't likely to fend off anything dangerous, but it made me feel a little safer. The wind had picked up again, whistling through the branches and sending leaves swirling in the air. That night, the footsteps returned, louder this time, circling the cabin several times. The cans clanged softly in the darkness. I lay awake, listening to the sounds of someone or something moving just beyond the window. The sense of being watched was overwhelming. I gripped the stick tightly, ready for whatever might come. At some point, the footsteps stopped. The night fell silent once more except for the crackling of the fire. Exhausted and shaken, I finally drifted off to sleep. The following morning, I was determined to leave. I packed quickly, my hands trembling as I stuffed my clothes and belongings into my bag. The forest no longer felt like a refuge but a trap. I locked the cabin door behind me and walked briskly toward my car, eyes scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. The drive out was tense. Every bump in the road, every shadow between the trees made me flinch. When I finally reached the paved road and saw the first signs of civilization, power lines, houses in the distance, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I was safe again. Looking back at the forest from a distance, I knew I had pushed myself far outside my comfort zone. The cabin had promised peace and solitude, but it had also shown me how fragile that peace could be when you're truly alone and cut off from the world. I realized then how important it was to be prepared and cautious, even when seeking escape. That weekend taught me a lot, not just about the forest or the cabin, but about fear and the strength it takes to face it. The memories of those footsteps, the silence, and the watching eyes stayed with me for a long time. But in the end, I left the forest behind and returned to the life I knew, grateful for the safety and the company of others. The cabin was just a place, but the experience was something I carried with me. It reminded me that being alone can be as terrifying as it is peaceful, and that sometimes the scariest things aren't monsters or ghosts, but the very real feeling of vulnerability and uncertainty in the dark. The sun was already low when I arrived at the cabin. It was a small, weathered structure tucked deep into the woods, far from any real town or road. The gravel driveway leading to it was overgrown with grass and small saplings, as if the place hadn't seen visitors in a long time. The air was cool and smelled of pine and damp earth. I was alone, just me and the cabin for the next few days, a planned break from the noise of the city and the endless screen glare of work. I pushed open the creaky front door, the hinges protesting with a long groan. Inside, the cabin was dark and smelled musty, like wood that had soaked up years of rain and dust. The floorboards creaked underfoot, uneven and worn smooth by time. A thin layer of dust coated the furniture. A rickety wooden table, a couple of chairs, and an old sofa with fabric faded beyond recognition. The fireplace was cold, its blackened bricks stained from countless fires long dead. I had brought a small suitcase, a few groceries, and a backpack with supplies. I set down my bags and flipped on the battery-powered lantern I'd brought along. Its soft, yellow light flickered across the walls, revealing faded wallpaper peeling in places and the thick wooden beams supporting the low ceiling. The windows were grimy and small, letting in little daylight. Despite the dust and age, the cabin felt solid, as if it had stood its ground against many storms. My plan was simple. For 3 days, I'd disconnect. No phone, no internet, no distractions. Just me, the woods, and whatever silence I could find. I'd brought some books, a journal, and enough food to get by. I'd camped before, but this was different. A real cabin in the middle of nowhere. No neighbors for miles, no cars, no lights other than what I made myself. After unpacking, I made a quick meal of canned beans heated over a small camping stove on the old kitchen counter. The sink was rusty, the faucet barely dripping water that smelled faintly metallic. I filled my water bottle and set it on the table. Then I stepped outside, breathing in the crisp evening air. The forest stretched out in every direction, thick with towering pines and hardwoods, their branches whispering softly in the wind. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the sky turned a deep shade of orange, bleeding into purple. Birds chirped their last songs before settling in for the night. The first stars began to appear, faint pinpricks of light in the growing dark. I set a fire in the fireplace using some dry kindling I found stacked near the door. The flames sputtered and caught, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Sitting close, I pulled out my journal and began to write. The only sound the crackling fire and the occasional rustle from outside. Night settled in fully. The forest was alive with sounds. Owls hooting somewhere far away, the scurrying of small animals in the underbrush, and the soft rustle of wind through the trees. It was peaceful but also made me aware of how isolated I truly was. Sleep was slow to come. The wooden floorboards creaked with every shift of the wind, and every small noise seemed amplified in the silence. I kept telling myself it was just animals, the natural world doing what it does. Eventually, I dozed off on the old sofa, a wool blanket wrapped tightly around me. The next morning, I woke to gray skies and a light drizzle tapping on the roof. The cabin smelled damp now, the moisture seeping through the thin walls. I boiled water over the stove for coffee and stood by the window, watching the drops bead and run down the glass. Outside, the forest was shrouded in mist, the trees appearing ghostly and distant. I spent the day exploring the area around the cabin, sticking close but trying to get a feel for the land. The forest floor was covered in leaves and broken branches, soft moss growing on fallen logs. Bird calls echoed between the trees. I found a narrow trail that led down to a small stream, its water clear and cold. I crouched and filled my water bottle, careful not to disturb the stones beneath the surface. Back at the cabin, I worked on cleaning a bit, wiping down surfaces and sweeping dust from the floor. I checked the woodpile outside and brought in some logs for the evening fire. The drizzle stopped, but the sky remained thick with clouds. As the light faded again, I built the fire, its warmth chasing away the chill. The cabin felt smaller at night, shadows creeping into every corner. The silence pressed in, making my own breathing sound loud and strange. That night, around midnight, I woke to a noise. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it was different, more deliberate. A soft tapping, like someone or something knocking on the outside walls. I froze, heart pounding. The cabin's wooden frame creaked in response, but the tapping continued, slow and rhythmic. I wanted to convince myself it was just a branch hitting the cabin or an animal, but the sound felt too steady, too purposeful. I stayed still, eyes wide in the dark, listening. The tapping stopped after a minute, leaving the cabin silent once more except for the fire's crackle. I told myself it was nothing, but sleep didn't come easily after that. The next day, I was more alert, my senses on edge. I spent hours walking the perimeter of the cabin, looking for signs of what might have caused the tapping. There were no broken branches or footprints near the cabin. The forest floor was soft from the rain, but nothing disturbed close to the walls. I went deeper into the woods, hoping to lose myself in the trees and find some peace. The damp earth was soft beneath my boots, and the smell of pine was strong. I moved carefully, watching for any wildlife. Deer tracks appeared in the mud, but nothing else seemed out of place. Returning to the cabin, I found the door slightly ajar. I was sure I had closed it tightly before. My heart jumped. I stepped inside quickly, scanning the room. Nothing was missing or moved, but the air felt colder, heavier somehow. I checked the windows, all locked as before. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Not in a ghostly way, but in a very real, very human way. Someone or something had been near the cabin. That night, I kept the fire burning late, sharpening a kitchen knife just in case. The tapping returned, this time louder, more insistent, came from the back of the cabin. I grabbed the lantern and crept to the door, swinging it open quickly to face the darkness. Nothing. I shone the light around the perimeter but saw no movement, no shapes. The forest was silent. I closed the door and bolted it, then sat down trying to calm my racing mind. The following morning, I found footprints in the soft earth near the cabin. Muddy, large, and definitely human. They led into the woods but did not return. Whoever had been here was cautious, but definitely watching. I considered leaving, but the nearest town was over an hour away, and the rain had returned, making the dirt road slick and treacherous. Plus, part of me wanted to prove I wasn't scared. This was just an old cabin in the woods, nothing more. I spent the next day repairing some loose boards on the porch and stacking more wood for the fire. Every now and then, I glanced into the trees, feeling eyes on me. That evening, the tapping was gone. The silence was thick but somehow less tense. I settled in early, reading by the fire. The wind howled outside, shaking the cabin gently, but inside I felt safe, almost. Just before dawn, a sudden, loud crash jolted me awake. I grabbed the lantern and hurried outside, heart hammering in my chest. Near the edge of the forest, I found a fallen tree, snapped at the base. Something big had pushed it over, too big for any deer or bear I'd seen before. Branches lay twisted and broken. I shone my light around but saw no movement. I knew then that whatever was out there was stronger, more dangerous than I had expected. I packed my bags quickly, deciding to leave at first light. I didn't care about the solitude anymore. Safety was the priority. As dawn broke, I locked up the cabin and started down the dirt road, eyes constantly scanning the trees. The forest seemed to watch me leave, silent and still. On the drive back, my mind replayed every noise, every shadow, every footstep. I didn't see anyone else on the road or near the cabin, but I knew I hadn't been alone. When I got home, I made sure to tell a friend about the cabin, where it was, what happened. I didn't want to keep it to myself. I knew someone might want to check the place out or at least be warned. I never went back. The woods hold many secrets, but some are best left undisturbed. The cabin was real, the sounds were real, and the footprints were real. But the thing pushing down trees and watching me from the dark, that's a story I'll carry with me forever. A reminder that sometimes the scariest things aren't ghosts or legends, but the wild, untamed parts of nature, and the people or animals who live there, unseen and waiting. I learned that night and in the days after, solitude can be a double-edged sword. It brings peace, but it also brings vulnerability. And when you're alone in the woods, the sky was a dull gray when I arrived at the cabin, nestled deep in the woods where the road ended and only dirt paths remained. I'd chosen this spot for the quiet, away from the noise and rush of the city, looking forward to a week of solitude. The forest stretched out all around, tall pine trees standing close together like silent guards. The smell of wet earth and pine needles filled the air, a scent I always found comforting. The gravel driveway was rough under my tires, small stones crunching as I pulled up near the weathered wooden cabin. The cabin looked older than I expected from the photos I saw online. Its dark brown logs were worn by years of rain and sun, with patches of moss growing in the corners where the roof met the walls. The windows were small and grimy, reflecting little light. A stone chimney jutted up from one side, stained black near the top. I grabbed my bags and headed inside, the door creaking as I pushed it open. Inside, it smelled like damp wood and dust, the air cool and heavy. The floorboards groaned underfoot as I moved through the small living room toward the kitchen. I set down my things and pulled open the cupboards, finding some basic cooking utensils and a rusty old kettle. No electricity or running water here. The cabin was off-grid, exactly what I wanted. I lit the gas stove with a match and boiled some water for tea. The tiny flames flickered in the dim light, shadows stretching long on the rough wooden walls. The only source of light came from the windows, but the overcast sky outside kept things muted and gray. I noticed spider webs in the corners of the ceiling and a layer of dust covering the shelves. This place hadn't seen visitors in a while. I unpacked my supplies: canned food, dry pasta, some fresh vegetables, and a few tools I thought I might need for repairs or emergencies. The cabin was simple, with one bedroom and a small bathroom where a hand pump was attached to a barrel outside to collect rainwater. The bed was a wooden frame with a thin mattress covered in a faded quilt. It looked uncomfortable, but I didn't plan to spend much time there except to sleep. I set my alarm clock, though I wasn't sure if it would work without batteries. I had a flashlight and extra batteries packed just in case. Outside, the trees swayed gently in the wind, their branches scratching softly against the roof. The silence was almost complete, broken only by the occasional call of a crow or the rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush. I walked around the cabin, inspecting the perimeter. The wood siding showed signs of rot near the bottom in places, and some of the nails had come loose. I made a mental note to check the roof for leaks and to clear the gutters of leaves and pine needles. The ground was muddy from recent rain, and the path leading to a nearby stream was slippery. That first night was cold. I stacked some dry logs in the fireplace and managed to get a fire going after several attempts. The crackling flames filled the room with warmth and flickering light, casting dancing shadows on the walls. I sat in an old armchair, the leather cracked and worn, and sipped my tea while listening to the sounds outside. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves seemed louder in the stillness, and I found myself glancing toward the windows more than once. I kept the curtains partly drawn, though I knew there was no one out there. Sleep didn't come easily. The unfamiliar creaks and groans of the cabin made me tense. The wind howled softly, slipping through gaps in the wood and whistling around the eaves. Every now and then, the floor beneath the stairs would emit a sudden sharp creak, like a footstep. I told myself it was just the house settling, or maybe an animal outside. But my heart kept beating faster, and I stayed awake for hours, staring into the dark corners of the room. Morning came slowly. I opened the curtains and let in what little daylight there was. The forest outside looked damp and misty, the fog hanging low between the trees. I pulled on my boots and went to the stream I'd spotted the day before. The water was cold and clear, rushing over smooth stones with a quiet murmur. I filled a bottle and drank deeply. The smell of wet moss and pine was fresh and clean, a sharp contrast to the stale air inside the cabin. I picked up some fallen branches nearby, thinking they might come in handy for the fire. Over the next few days, I settled into a routine. Mornings were for gathering firewood, checking the water barrel, and cooking simple meals. Afternoons I spent exploring the surrounding woods, always staying close enough to find my way back. The forest was dense, the ground uneven and covered in thick layers of fallen needles and leaves. I found animal tracks on the trails, deer, rabbits, and the occasional raccoon. One day, I spotted the tracks of a larger animal, maybe a coyote or a wild dog. It made me cautious but didn't scare me. I kept my knife close and stayed alert. Inside the cabin, I fixed a few things. I tightened loose boards on the porch, sealed some gaps around the windows with strips of cloth, and cleaned out the gutters. I found an old first aid kit under the sink, half expired but still useful. My phone had no signal, but I brought a small radio that worked on batteries, mainly to listen to the weather reports. The forecast was for more rain over the next few days, so I made sure to keep the firewood dry and the windows sealed tight. One evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, I noticed something odd. The cabin door, which I had locked firmly earlier that day, was slightly ajar. My stomach tightened. I was sure I had locked it. I checked the latch and it clicked shut, but the uneasy feeling stayed with me. I double-checked the windows and secured them with wooden bars I found in the shed outside. Maybe the wind had blown the door open, or maybe I hadn't locked it properly in the first place. I told myself it was nothing. That night, the noises were worse. The wind was stronger, rattling the windows and shaking the branches against the walls. Somewhere outside, a tree limb snapped sharply. The fire in the fireplace sputtered and dimmed, the smoke curling up the chimney in thin wisps. I kept the flashlight nearby and stayed alert. The creaks and groans of the cabin felt louder than ever, and the silence in between was tense and thick. I forced myself to breathe slowly, to focus on the firelight rather than the dark shadows that seemed to gather in the corners. The next day, I found more signs something wasn't right. Near the edge of the clearing around the cabin, there were footprints, fresh ones, not mine. They were large and messy, pressed deep into the muddy earth. They circled around the back of the cabin and disappeared into the trees. My heart raced as I traced the prints with my eyes. Whoever or whatever had made them had been here recently. I checked my supplies and found the knife missing from where I had left it on the kitchen table. It wasn't a small thing to lose by accident. I searched the cabin carefully but found no sign of forced entry besides the door left open the night before. The locks hadn't been broken. The windows were all intact. It was as if someone had slipped in and out quietly, taking the knife and leaving the footprints. I felt a chill that wasn't from the cold air. I made a quick meal and ate with my back against the wall, watching the door and windows. Every rustle outside made me jump. I knew I couldn't just stay and wait for whatever had come here to return. I packed my bags quickly, checked the map, and planned a route back to the main road. The sun was setting again, and the forest was darkening fast. I grabbed the flashlight, made sure my phone was off to save battery, and locked the door behind me as best I could. I took a deep breath and stepped out onto the porch. The woods were alive with sounds: the hoot of an owl, the rustle of small animals scurrying through the underbrush. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, making the path nearly invisible. I held the flashlight low, trying to keep the beam steady on the narrow trail. The footprints were still visible in the mud, but now they were deeper and more frequent. I kept moving, telling myself the way out was only a few miles. I had to keep calm. After about an hour of walking, I heard something behind me. At first, it was just a faint crack, like a branch snapping underfoot. I stopped and held my breath, listening. The sound came again, closer this time, slow and deliberate. I turned around slowly, shining the flashlight through the trees, but saw nothing. My heart pounded louder in my chest. I started walking faster, my footsteps crunching loudly on the dry leaves. The noise followed me, matching my pace, sometimes stopping and starting, like whoever it was trying to stay hidden but still close. I didn't dare look back again. I focused on the trail, the way the trees thinned out ahead, promising the end of the woods. The flashlight's beam flickered once, then went out, leaving me in almost complete darkness. I fumbled with the batteries, my hands shaking. After what felt like forever, the light came back on. Finally, the trees opened up to the edge of a gravel road. I ran toward the streetlight at the corner, relief flooding me. A car was parked nearby, my neighbor from the next cabin over, someone I hadn't met but knew from the community messages. I called out, waving my arms, and they spotted me quickly. They helped me back to their place where I could call for a ride. The police came. I had been looking forward to getting away for a while. Things in the city were wearing me down. Long days, too much noise, and the same daily routine that made the weeks blur together. I needed somewhere quiet, somewhere off the map where I didn't have to think about anything for a few days. I found this listing online, some private rental way up north in the Adirondacks. It wasn't even on one of the big vacation sites, just a random forum post that linked to a smaller rental website. It had pictures of this old wooden cabin surrounded by trees, with a dirt trail leading in, no neighbors, no internet, and barely a cell signal. That's exactly what I was looking for. I booked it for 5 days and took a week off work. I told a couple friends where I'd be, left my place in the early morning, and drove upstate with my car full of supplies. Cans, water, flashlight batteries, propane for a small stove, extra fuel, my sleeping bag, clothes, tools, and even a small hatchet. I didn't want to rely on anything being up there. From the way the guy described it in the listing, the cabin hadn't been used in months. The road up was mostly paved until the last 20 or so miles. Then it was gravel, then dirt. I kept having to slow down for potholes and fallen branches. No houses, no stores, no signs. Eventually, I came to a fork in the road with a faded wooden arrow nailed to a tree. The hand-painted sign just said, Cabin 3. I followed that trail for another 10 minutes, the trees getting tighter around the car. It felt like the forest was swallowing me up. I saw the cabin just as I started to wonder if I'd made a mistake. It was small but solid looking, weathered wood siding, a steep metal roof with some rust on it, and a small porch with 2 old chairs. A chimney poked out of the roof, though I didn't plan to use the fireplace. I parked beside it on the flattened dirt area and killed the engine. The silence hit me right away. No traffic, no people, just wind moving through the trees and the occasional creak of the old wood in the cabin. I unlocked the front door with the key the owner had mailed me. Inside, it smelled dry and dusty, but not moldy. One big room with a twin-sized bed on one side, a small kitchenette with an old gas stove, and a round table with 2 chairs. There was a metal wood stove in the corner for heat, and a single window in the front. No bathroom. There was an outhouse about 30 feet away into the woods. The floorboards creaked with every step, and the walls were rough and unpainted. It was basic, but it was what I wanted. I spent the first couple of hours unpacking and cleaning. The place had mouse droppings in the corners and a couple of dead spiders on the windowsill. I wiped things down, swept out the dust, and checked the stove to make sure it worked. The propane line seemed fine. I cracked open a few windows to air it out and sat on the porch drinking water, watching the sun drift lower through the trees. Felt peaceful, disconnected. I hadn't felt like that in months. The first night was cold, but I had packed thermals and my sleeping bag was rated for below freezing. I made a small dinner on the stove, then read for a bit by flashlight until my eyes got heavy. I could hear things outside, branches snapping, leaves rustling, maybe a raccoon or two, but nothing out of the ordinary. I wasn't scared, just aware of how far I was from anyone else. The next morning, I woke up early and made coffee. The quiet was different this time. Still there, but heavier somehow. I walked around the cabin, just exploring. The trail behind it led to a small creek maybe 100 yards away. The water was clear and fast, cutting through rocks and fallen branches. I spent the day walking and resting, making a small fire pit beside the cabin, and chopping some wood from fallen limbs. I didn't bring any alcohol or anything to distract myself. I just wanted the quiet. But that night something felt wrong. I had gone to sleep a little after 10, bundled up in the bag, the wind outside calm. I woke up maybe 2 hours later, sweating. Not because I was hot. Something had jolted me awake. I stayed still for a moment, listening. It was too quiet. No wind, no rustling, just a heavy stillness pressing against the walls. I reached for my flashlight and turned it on. The room looked normal, but then I saw something. Near the window on the inside ledge were 2 smudges, small, like from fingers. They hadn't been there when I cleaned earlier. I got up and looked closer. They were faint, but real. 2 marks, about an inch apart, as if someone had leaned a hand against the glass. I stood there staring at them, trying to make sense of it. I walked outside with my flashlight, shining it across the dirt around the cabin. No footprints, no signs of anything. Maybe it had been me earlier. Maybe I'd touched the glass without thinking. I told myself that and went back to bed. But I didn't sleep much after that. I kept the flashlight close and listened for every small sound. The next day, I tried to shake it off. Went down to the creek, washed my face, walked deeper into the woods along the trail. I found an old tree stand, probably left by hunters years ago. The metal rusted and the ladder mostly broken. I didn't climb it, just marked it in my head as a landmark. I stayed out until late afternoon. When I got back, the sun was already behind the trees. The cabin looked darker than usual. I stepped up onto the porch and noticed the door wasn't fully closed. I stopped. I knew I'd locked it. I always locked it, even though no one was supposed to be around. I opened it slowly, holding the flashlight like a weapon even though it was still light out. Inside looked the same at first glance, but something was off. One of the chairs was turned slightly. A fork was on the floor by the kitchenette. My backpack, which I'd left on the table, was now on the bed. I searched the cabin from top to bottom, looked under the bed, checked the closet beside the door, even opened the tiny hatch to the attic space under the roof. Nothing. No one. I walked around the outside, checked the bushes, the edge of the woods. No tracks, no broken branches, nothing out of place. I even checked the outhouse. Empty. I sat on the porch for a long time, heart racing, eyes scanning the trees. I told myself maybe a raccoon got in, maybe I forgot to lock it, maybe it was just my mind messing with me from being alone too long. But I knew that wasn't it. Someone had been inside. That night, I barely slept. I kept a hatchet by the bed and slept with my boots on. I didn't hear anything, but when I woke up, one of the porch chairs was turned facing the woods. I hadn't touched those chairs since the first day. I wanted to leave, but the car wouldn't start. I turned the key and it just clicked. Dead battery. I tried the lights, nothing. I checked under the hood, but I didn't know much about engines. The cables looked fine. The battery wasn't that old. I had jumper cables, but no second vehicle. No signal on my phone either. I walked up the road for maybe a mile, holding the phone above my head. Still nothing. So I went back. I figured I'd just wait it out, pack my things, and try the car again in the morning. Maybe the cold had drained the battery. Maybe it needed time. I didn't want to panic yet. That night was the worst. I heard it just after midnight. A noise outside, not an animal. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching the dry leaves behind the cabin. I sat up fast, grabbed the flashlight and hatchet, and moved to the window. I shut off the light and waited, eyes adjusting to the moonlight. A figure moved between the trees. Not fast, just walking, back and forth, staying in the shadows, like they knew where the moonlight hit. I couldn't make out a face, just a shape. I stayed there for maybe an hour, frozen, watching. They didn't come closer, just moved in and out of sight, like they were circling. Eventually, I stopped hearing the footsteps. I stayed awake until the sky turned gray. I opened the door slowly and checked around. No one, but this time I found something. A piece of cloth caught on the corner of the woodpile behind the cabin. It was dark blue, frayed at the edges, like from an old jacket. I took it and put it in my backpack. I didn't know why. I just didn't want to leave it behind. The car started that morning, just like that, turned over on the first try. I didn't waste time. I loaded my gear in 10 minutes and drove out without even looking back at the cabin. I didn't feel safe until I saw pavement again. When I got home, I looked up that listing again. It was gone. The entire site was offline. I tried to trace the email confirmation I'd gotten when I booked it, but it bounced back. No phone number, no contact, like it had never existed. A few days later, I went through my backpack to unpack and found the piece of cloth again. It was stuffed in the bottom where I'd forgotten about it, but now it smelled like smoke. Not strong, just faint, like burnt wood. I never figured out who was out there or what they wanted. I checked news reports, forums, everything I could. Nothing. No missing person reports, no arrests, no break-ins in that area. But I think about it sometimes, how isolated that place was. How easy it would be for someone to watch from the trees, to move between the shadows, to wait. I rented the cabin because I needed to get away from the city. Things had been stacking up on me for months. Work deadlines, relationship stress, constant noise, and just that general feeling like you're being crushed under everything and there's no space to breathe. I found the cabin on a listing site. It wasn't flashy or modern. It looked plain, older, like it had been there for decades without any big renovations. That's what I wanted, quiet, simple, and as far from other people as possible. The owner listed it as a primitive hunter's cabin tucked in a valley in the northern part of Vermont, with no cell service and no internet. It was about a 20-minute drive from the nearest paved road, surrounded by trees on all sides. Sounded perfect. I packed up for 5 nights. Brought dry food, a cooler of perishables, some basic tools, a flashlight, a camp stove, a sleeping bag, a water filter, and a few books I'd been meaning to read. I had no interest in hiking or sightseeing. I just wanted to be still for a while. The drive up took most of the day. The last few miles were slow going, with a narrow dirt road winding through dense trees, barely wide enough for my car. By the time I pulled up in front of the cabin, the sun was dipping low behind the ridge. The cabin looked like the pictures, wooden walls dark from age, a sloped metal roof, small windows, and a porch with a single old chair. There were pine needles and leaves all over the steps. The air smelled like sap and damp dirt. Inside, it was one room, a cot against the wall with a wool blanket folded neatly on top. A small wood stove in one corner with a few logs stacked beside it. A chipped table with 2 chairs. A shelf with a few mismatched dishes. No electricity, no running water. There was a dry toilet about 20 yards behind the cabin and a small spring nearby that the owner said was safe to drink from with a filter. I set my bag down, rolled out my sleeping bag, and cracked open a can of soup. The quiet was total. It wasn't just the absence of traffic or talking or phones buzzing. It was that deep, heavy silence that you only find in woods far away from anything. I sat outside on the steps with the soup and listened to the breeze moving through the trees and some small animal shuffling in the leaves nearby. That first night, I slept better than I had in months. No headlights flashing across the ceiling. No distant sirens. Just the faint creak of the trees and the soft pop of the cooling stovepipe. I woke up just after sunrise to birds calling and a bit of fog curling between the trees. I made coffee on the camp stove and sat on the porch with a book. It was exactly what I needed. The first 2 days were uneventful, just peaceful. I read, wrote a little in a notebook, made simple meals, walked around the cabin area. There was an old overgrown trail behind the cabin, barely visible under the ferns and brush, and I followed it a few times, just far enough to stretch my legs. I didn't see another person or even signs of people. No planes overhead, no distant sounds of trucks or chainsaws or dogs. I didn't even see any deer or squirrels, which I thought was strange, but didn't think too much about it. I figured maybe the area was just quiet like that. It was the third night when I started feeling off. Not scared exactly, but unsettled. I was lying in the cot, trying to fall asleep, and I thought I heard a rustle outside. Not the normal kind of rustle that wind makes in branches. This was lower, steadier, like footsteps through dry leaves. I held still, breathing shallow, and listened. It stopped. I told myself it was probably a raccoon or something similar and rolled over. But then I noticed something I hadn't before. The cabin wasn't completely dark. There was the faintest bit of light coming in through one of the windows, like the moonlight was being blocked or filtered. I got up, went to the window slowly, and looked out. At first, I didn't see anything, but then I noticed something just at the edge of the trees, darker than the rest of the forest. It wasn't moving. I stared for a long time, but the shape didn't shift or come closer. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just a tree or a shadow, something that looked strange only because I was half asleep. In the morning, I went outside and checked the area. There were no tracks, no broken branches, nothing, but the shape had been real enough to make my heart race. I walked a little farther down the slope behind the cabin, just looking around, and I found something I hadn't seen before. About 50 yards down, there was an old pile of boards and rusted metal half buried in leaves. It looked like the remains of a collapsed shed. Maybe it had been another cabin at some point. I walked around it carefully, but didn't see anything that stood out, just rot and rust. Back at the cabin, I tried to settle back into the quiet, made breakfast, cleaned up, read, stretched, wrote a little, but the feeling didn't go away. I kept looking over my shoulder. Every sound outside seemed sharper, closer. I started noticing little things I hadn't paid attention to before. How the leaves in one spot beside the cabin looked disturbed, or how the air felt too still at times, like it was waiting. That night, I double-checked the door latch and brought the flashlight into the cot with me. I didn't fall asleep easily. Every creak felt louder. At some point, I must have dozed off, but I woke up again in total darkness to the sound of something brushing against the outside wall. I sat up fast, heart hammering, and held my breath. The sound came again, slow and steady, not a branch in the wind. It was too rhythmic, like a hand or a body sliding along the logs. Then silence. I didn't move. I stayed like that for maybe half an hour, barely blinking. Eventually, the sound didn't return, and I must have drifted off sitting upright. In the morning, I went outside with the flashlight still in my hand. I walked the perimeter of the cabin slowly. On the back wall, just under the window near the cot, there were faint marks in the dirt. Not boot prints exactly, more like shallow impressions. Could have been from an animal, I told myself. I told myself that a lot that day, but I couldn't shake the sense that someone had been there, that they were still close. I didn't have cell signal, no way to call out. I could have driven back out, but it felt like giving up. I told myself I only had 2 nights left. I could handle 2 more nights. That 4th day, I kept a knife on my belt, just a small one from my pack, but it made me feel a little better. I tried to go about the day like normal, collecting firewood, boiling water, sitting outside for a while, but I kept scanning the trees. Couldn't relax. I noticed more small things. A broken pine branch that hadn't been broken the day before. A boot-sized scuff in the mud near the old trail. I couldn't say for sure if they were new, but it felt like they were. I decided to go back down to the old shed ruin before dark. I wanted to be sure there wasn't someone sleeping there or stashing stuff. I brought the flashlight and the knife and moved slowly. When I got there, I walked the area carefully. Same as before, just broken wood, rusted nails, and piles of leaves. But this time, I noticed something buried deeper, a corner of what looked like plastic. I dug around it with a stick until I pulled it loose. It was a tarp, green and stiff with age. Underneath it were more boards, some with saw marks, and an old metal can. Nothing that said someone had been there recently, but the tarp didn't look more than a few years old. It didn't feel right. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in the cot with the flashlight in my hand and my ears straining for any sound. For a long time, nothing. Then, just past midnight, I heard something tap the wall near my head. Just once. Then again, softer. Then silence. I didn't move. The flashlight beam wavered in my shaking hand. I waited for what felt like hours, but nothing else happened. When it got light enough outside, I packed everything up. Food, clothes, stove. I didn't make breakfast. I shoved everything into the bags and loaded the car. I planned to leave early anyway. I told myself just a day early. That was all. As I backed out of the clearing and started the slow drive down the dirt road, I kept checking the rear view. I didn't see anything, but just as I turned onto the paved road, I glanced at the passenger seat and noticed something I hadn't put there. It was a single pine cone sitting on top of my folded jacket. I hadn't collected any pine cones. I hadn't brought one in. I don't know how it got there. I stopped the car, picked it up, and threw it into the woods. My heart was pounding again. I drove all the way home with the windows cracked and the music loud, just to feel like I was somewhere real again. I didn't go back. I didn't leave a review on the site. I didn't message the owner. For weeks after, I kept checking over my shoulder at home, checking my locks twice, listening for sounds outside that didn't belong. I didn't find anything. Nothing happened, but the feeling didn't go away. It still hasn't completely. There was someone out there. I know it. Watching. Waiting. Maybe they didn't want to hurt me. Maybe they were just curious. But they were there, and they knew I was alone. And quiet places don't always mean safe places. I learned that out there, and I never want to learn it again. I didn't plan to stay in that cabin alone. Originally, it was supposed to be a weekend getaway with my cousin Dan, a kind of quiet break from everything back home. We'd both been dealing with a lot: work stress, family drama, the usual things that stack up when you're not paying attention. He found the cabin on some rental site, tucked in a wooded patch near a lake about 4 hours outside of Kansas City. The photos made it look peaceful. Simple wood frame, tin roof, deck out front, dense trees in every direction. It was owned by some older guy who had it built in the early 90s. Said he barely used it anymore but kept it in decent shape. Dan canceled the morning we were supposed to drive out. Some last-minute emergency with his girlfriend. He said I should still go, that it might do me some good. I didn't want to waste the time off, and the thought of sitting in total quiet for a few days started to sound better the more I thought about it. So I went by myself. It was late October, and the trees were turning every shade of yellow, orange, and brown. The drive took longer than I expected because I kept stopping to get snacks and fuel, and then I got a little turned around the last 20 miles. The roads weren't marked well, and I lost cell signal somewhere after I passed a rusted-out bus that looked like it hadn't moved in decades. Eventually, I found the narrow gravel path that led back through the trees. It wound around for maybe a mile, and then the cabin came into view, sitting right near the edge of a small lake. There was a fire pit made out of mismatched stones out front, and an old aluminum canoe leaning against one side of the cabin. The front door stuck when I tried to open it, but after a bit of shoving, it popped loose. Inside was about what I expected. A small kitchen with a gas stove, a fridge humming quietly, a table with 2 chairs, and a living room with a lumpy couch and a couple of folded wool blankets. There was a loft above with a mattress on the floor and a single window that looked out over the woods behind the place. The bathroom was tiny, but it had hot water and decent water pressure, which was all I really cared about. The first evening was calm. I unpacked, made a sandwich, and sat out on the little porch with a beer in hand as the sun dropped below the trees. It got dark fast out there. No streetlights, no house lights in the distance, just total blackness except for the stars. I brought a small camping lantern and used it to read a paperback until I got tired. Then I climbed up to the loft, lay on the old mattress, and listened to the crickets and frogs outside. I slept fine. It was the next day when I noticed something strange. I'd gone for a walk around the lake, taking slow steps and just trying to enjoy the quiet. On the far side of the water, maybe 200 yards from the cabin, I found what looked like an old shed, half covered in moss and leaned slightly to one side. The door was padlocked, and a tarp covered part of the roof. A few empty gas cans sat off to the side, and the grass around it had been flattened like someone had walked through there often. I didn't think much of it. Maybe the owner stored tools in there or used it as a backup supply shed. I walked back to the cabin and read most of the afternoon. That night, I woke up around 2 a.m. to a sound I couldn't place. It wasn't loud, just a soft, rhythmic scraping. I lay still, staring at the ceiling, trying to figure it out. It was coming from outside, maybe the side of the cabin. I figured it might be a raccoon or a branch tapping against the siding. After about 10 minutes, it stopped, and I went back to sleep. The next morning, I walked around the cabin to check for any signs of an animal. I didn't see anything right away, but then I noticed fresh scuff marks in the dirt near the back wall, like something had been dragged. The marks didn't go far, just a few feet before vanishing into the leaves. It didn't look like a paw print or shoe tread, just smooth lines like something heavy had been pulled across the ground. I told myself not to overthink it. Maybe the wind knocked over something that had since rolled into the brush. Maybe deer passed through. I tried not to let it get in my head. Later that day, while gathering firewood a bit deeper in the woods, I found a small pile of clothes. At first, I thought someone dumped laundry there, but when I looked closer, I saw they were stiff from rain and sun. Jeans, a flannel shirt, even socks and underwear. No wallet, no ID. They were folded loosely, as if someone had taken them off and set them down. The weird part was how clean they looked, considering they were in the woods. No rips, no animal bites, no stains beyond what you'd expect from sitting outside. I left them where they were and walked back a bit faster than usual. I didn't say anything out loud, but my brain wouldn't let it go. I kept thinking, who just takes off all their clothes in the middle of the woods? And why fold them? I barely slept that night. The noises came back, scraping again, and something that sounded like a low thump, like someone placing a heavy box down on a wooden floor. It was too regular to be an animal. Every few seconds, like a slow heartbeat. It stopped after a while, but not before I started sweating under the blanket. I stayed inside most of the next day. I made coffee, read the same paragraph in my book about 10 times, and kept looking out the windows. I didn't even want to go to the shed or back toward the pile of clothes. I started to feel like someone else was out there, watching. I catch myself staring out at the trees and then snap out of it like I'd been in a trance. Nothing ever moved, but I felt something. Not a ghost or anything, just presence. Like how you know someone's behind you even if they don't say anything. Later that afternoon, I finally decided to go down to the shed. I don't know why. Maybe I thought I'd find a trail cam or a generator or something that explained the noises. When I got there, the padlock was gone. The door was closed but slightly off its hinge, just enough that it rocked a little in the breeze. Inside, it was mostly empty. A few crates, an old water jug, and a rusted toolbox on a shelf. But there was also a sleeping bag unrolled on the floor, and a pile of snack wrappers next to it, protein bars, trail mix packets, an empty can of beans. They weren't old. The wrappers weren't faded or wet. Someone had been sleeping in there recently. I backed out slowly, closed the door, and didn't touch anything. I walked quickly, not running but close to it. My heart was pounding by the time I got back to the cabin. I locked the front door, then pushed a chair under the knob. I even stacked a few pots in front of the back door so I'd hear if it opened. That night, the noises were louder. Not just scraping now, but soft footsteps on the porch. They moved slowly, like someone testing the boards. Then the front doorknob rattled. Not hard, not like someone trying to break in. Just enough to check if it was locked. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The footsteps circled the cabin once, then disappeared. I didn't sleep at all. The next morning, I packed everything. I was done. I didn't care if I lost the deposit or if the owner was pissed. I shoved everything in my duffel and carried it to the car in one trip. The gravel road seemed longer on the way out. I kept checking the rearview mirror like an idiot, half expecting to see someone standing in the trees. When I got back home, I didn't tell anyone much, just that the cabin was boring and I wanted to come back early. But it stuck with me. A few weeks later, I tried to look up the listing again to see if anyone else had mentioned weird stuff in the reviews. The listing was gone. I searched the name of the guy who owned it. Nothing. I tried the coordinates I had written down from the directions. No results. It was like the place never existed online. But I know what I saw. Someone was living out there. Someone who didn't want to be found. And I think I got too close. They didn't attack or say anything. They didn't need to. They just let me know they were there. And that was enough. I never went back, and I never will. But sometimes when I'm walking through woods or driving past a stretch of trees, I get that same feeling. Like someone's there, just out of sight, standing still and watching. And I wonder how long they've been doing it, and how many people went to that cabin before me and never made it out. I had been working in the city nonstop for almost 9 months before I finally burned out. It was like one morning I just woke up, stared at my computer screen, and couldn't move. Not from pain or sickness, but like something in me just shut down. I told my boss I needed time off, and to my surprise, she didn't argue. She just looked at me and nodded. I guess I wasn't hiding the exhaustion as well as I thought. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, not even my friends. I just packed up and left. I booked a small cabin through one of those vacation rental sites. It was deep in the woods in northern Minnesota, about 4 hours north of Duluth. The listing said it was on private land with a mile-long driveway and no neighbors for at least 5 miles in any direction. That sounded perfect. I wasn't looking for anything fancy, just peace, quiet, and space to breathe again. The pictures showed a simple wooden cabin with a tin roof, a small porch, and a fire pit out front. It had solar panels for basic electricity, a wood stove for heat, and no Wi-Fi. That was exactly what I wanted. I got there in the early afternoon on a cloudy Thursday in late September. The leaves had just started changing. Bright orange and red speckled the forest around me as I drove down the long dirt path leading to the cabin. The place looked exactly like the pictures. Tiny, old but well-kept, with a split log pile stacked up neatly along the side. I parked and stepped out into a kind of silence I hadn't heard in years. No cars, no voices, not even the hum of power lines. Just wind moving through trees and the occasional chirp of a bird. Inside, the cabin smelled like cedar and old books. The interior was small, one room with a bed, a table, a small kitchen area with a propane stove, and the wood stove in the corner. There was a bathroom with a composting toilet and a gravity-fed shower setup, which I figured I'd only use if I absolutely had to. I spent the rest of that day unpacking and walking around the land. There were animal trails through the woods, probably deer or foxes, maybe even a bear. I didn't mind. The first 2 days were exactly what I hoped for. I read, cooked simple meals, took naps. I didn't see another human being, not even a plane in the sky. I started to feel like I could think clearly again. I slept deeply at night with the windows open and the sound of wind in the trees. On the third night, I heard something strange. I had gone to bed around 10 after putting a few more logs in the stove. I was drifting off when I heard a knock. Not on the door, but a sharp, distinct clack against the side of the cabin. It came from the back where the forest came right up to the wall. I froze, listening. It happened again. Just once, like someone tapping on the outside wall with a rock or a stick. I got up and went to the window, but it was too dark to see anything. I turned on the small exterior floodlight by the porch. The back wall had no windows, I grabbed the flashlight, stepped onto the porch, and walked around the cabin. My boots crunched on fallen leaves. I scanned the woods, the ground, the side of the cabin. Nothing. No animals, no branches out of place, no signs of anything. I went back inside, locked the door even though it felt silly, and went to bed. I didn't hear anything else that night. The next morning, I went to the back of the cabin to look around in the daylight. There were no marks on the wall, no tracks. I tried to brush it off as a tree branch knocked loose in the wind, maybe something falling from above. But the thing was, it hadn't been windy. The trees were still. I kept thinking about how clear that sound was. It had been deliberate, like someone tapping. That day, I went for a longer hike, trying to shake the unease. I followed a game trail that led down a shallow hill, through a stand of birch, and into a small hollow where there was an overgrown hunting blind made of rotting plywood. I didn't stay long. Something about that spot felt off. It was colder, damper. The light didn't hit it the same way. I turned around and made my way back up the hill. That night, I brought some of the split logs inside before it got dark. I didn't want to go out at night again. I cooked dinner, read for a while, then lay in bed watching the shadows of tree branches sway on the ceiling. Around midnight, I heard it again. This time, it wasn't from the back wall. It was from the porch. The unmistakable sound of a footstep on the wood. Just one. Then nothing. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. I held my breath and listened. Another step, slow, heavy. Not an animal. Not a raccoon or fox. It was the sound of a person trying to move quietly. I didn't have a gun. All I had was a heavy iron fire poker and a knife I used for cooking. I grabbed both and moved slowly toward the front door. The porch light was off. I hadn't turned it on. I looked through the small window but couldn't see anything. I stayed still, every muscle tense. The footsteps stopped. After about 20 minutes, I finally opened the door a crack and flipped on the light. The porch was empty. The ground was covered in dry leaves. But there were no tracks, no signs anyone had stood there. I barely slept that night. The next day, I seriously considered leaving. I even packed some of my things, but I talked myself down. Maybe it was just my imagination, fueled by too much isolation. Maybe I had heard a deer, or even my own movement in the bed. The woods play tricks on people. I unpacked and tried to go about my day like normal, but the feeling didn't go away. It got worse. I kept noticing little things that seemed off. A piece of firewood that had been moved from the stack. A cup I could have sworn I left on the table now sitting by the sink. The back door, barely used, had fresh dirt on the threshold. I convinced myself I was being paranoid. On the 6th night, I didn't go to bed. I sat in a chair by the window with the fire poker across my lap and the lights off. I waited. At 1:17 a.m., I saw movement. A dark figure passed just at the edge of the trees, moving slowly toward the cabin. I didn't breathe. It stopped about 15 feet from the porch. Just stood there. I could barely see it, but the shape was unmistakable, human. No flashlight, no sound. Just watching. It stayed there for almost half an hour, not moving. Then it backed up into the trees and was gone. I slept during the day after that, locked the doors and stayed awake all night. The next few nights passed the same way. Movement in the trees, sometimes closer. Once I heard breathing just outside the window. I was afraid to turn on the lights. I didn't want whoever it was to know I saw them. The worst was the 8th night. It was raining and I thought maybe they wouldn't come. Around 3 a.m., I heard the doorknob rattle. Slow, deliberate, then a sharp knock just like the first night, followed by silence. I sat there for what felt like hours, muscles locked, staring at the door. I knew someone had been touching it. I left the next morning, packed everything in 20 minutes, didn't even bother folding clothes. I drove away without looking back. The road was slick, the leaves heavy with rain, but I didn't stop. When I got to the gas station 2 hours away, I used their Wi-Fi to check the property listing. It had been removed. I tried to contact the owner. The number was disconnected. Out of curiosity, I searched the land records for the area. The property had belonged to a man named Gerald Quist. He went missing in 2002. His truck was found on the property, but his body was never recovered. The land had sat vacant for almost 15 years before someone tried to rent it out as a vacation spot. I told the sheriff's office everything when I got home. They filed a report but said they couldn't do anything without more evidence. The property was too remote, and no crime had technically occurred. It's been almost a year now. I still think about it. I don't go camping anymore. I don't even like being home alone. I installed cameras, motion lights, new locks. I checked them every night before I sleep. Whatever was out there didn't follow me, but I don't think I was the first person they watched in that cabin. And I'm afraid I won't be the last. I had been feeling overwhelmed for months. Between my job at the warehouse, the never-ending overtime, and the buzzing city life, I felt like I was slowly being drained dry. I hadn't taken any time off in almost 2 years, and it had finally caught up to me. I didn't want to fly anywhere, didn't want a beach or some hotel. I just needed silence. I needed space. That's how I ended up booking a remote cabin up in Vermont for a week. It wasn't listed on Airbnb or any big rental site. A guy I used to work with years ago had shared it with me, said his uncle owned a place way up in the mountains near the Canadian border, middle of nowhere. No neighbors, no traffic, no cell service. It sounded perfect. I packed light, just clothes, my sleeping bag, canned food, a few books, and my phone for offline music. I also brought a cheap battery-powered radio and a hunting knife I'd kept from my dad's stuff. The drive from Boston took about 6 hours, but once I passed the last small town, the landscape completely changed. The trees grew denser, the road narrowed, and everything felt untouched. I followed the directions exactly. It was a rough dirt road for the last few miles, barely wide enough for my car, and the woods started feeling almost claustrophobic. But then, right where the old map sketch said it would be, the cabin came into view. It was small, just one floor, made of old, weathered wood with a tin roof. There was a porch with a rotting rocking chair, and a small shed off to the side, partly hidden by trees. The windows were clouded with age. It looked like no one had been there for a while. I parked, killed the engine, and sat for a moment with the windows down. No wind, no traffic, no distant hum of anything. Just birds and the occasional rustling of leaves. I let myself breathe for the first time in weeks. Inside, the cabin smelled like old wood and dust. There was a small kitchen area, a living room with a wood stove, and a tiny bedroom in the back with a creaky bed frame. The water was from a hand pump outside, and the bathroom was an outhouse about 50 yards into the woods. There was no electricity except for a solar panel rigged to a battery, which barely powered a single overhead light. I didn't mind. It was exactly what I wanted. The first day was peaceful. I walked around the property, explored a bit of the forest surrounding the cabin, and cooked beans over a small propane stove. I sat on the porch until nightfall, watching the sky change color. There were no stars back in the city, but out here, the night sky looked endless. I fell asleep early, worn out in the best way. The next morning, I woke up around 6. I made instant coffee and took it outside. The fog sat low between the trees, and the quiet was deep. I heard a woodpecker tapping away somewhere. I walked around the cabin again, more out of habit than curiosity, and noticed something I hadn't the day before. Behind the shed, a faint trail cut through the woods. It wasn't wide or clear like a hiking path, but it was too clean to be natural. I figured it was probably used years ago and had just faded. I decided to follow it a bit after breakfast. The trail dipped down into a shallow ravine and curved up again on the other side. I didn't see any tracks or signs of animals, but I saw pieces of old fence nailed to trees and rusted metal half buried in the soil, probably remnants of an old property line. After about 30 minutes of slow walking, I came across an old wooden post sticking out of the ground with some kind of hook on it. Nearby was a flattened patch of ground surrounded by rocks in a circle, maybe an old fire pit or camp spot. I sat there for a bit before heading back. When I got to the cabin, I checked my phone out of habit even though I knew there was no signal. I put on a little music and made lunch. The rest of the day passed quietly. I read on the porch until dark and kept the door locked just because I always do. It was the third day that something started feeling off. I'd woken up with a slight headache, which wasn't too unusual, but when I walked around the property that morning, I noticed a few things I hadn't left that way. The lid to the water barrel outside had been taken off and set aside. I always closed it to keep bugs out. There were also fresh footprints in the dirt near the outhouse, boot prints, not mine. Mine were from sneakers, and I hadn't worn boots once since I got there. At first, I tried to reason it out. Maybe animals? Maybe I had left the lid off and forgot? But the footprints were clear. Too heavy for an animal and too deep to be old. I followed them back into the woods a few yards, but they vanished into harder ground where I couldn't track them. That made me uneasy. The rest of the day I felt watched. I know how paranoid that sounds, but there was a stillness in the trees that didn't feel right. I stayed close to the cabin, kept the door locked, and left the hunting knife on the table. That night I slept light, waking up at every noise outside, every creak. Around 2 a.m., I thought I heard a soft crunch on the leaves outside. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, and listened, but it was dead silent. I didn't sleep after that. The next morning, I found the rocking chair on the porch was turned around, facing the woods. I had left it facing the cabin wall. I know I had. That wasn't something I'd mix up. I walked out into the woods and checked all around the cabin. No sign of anyone. No new footprints, nothing disturbed. But the trail behind the shed, it looked slightly more worn than it had a few days ago, like someone else had walked it. I spent that day pacing the cabin, constantly looking out the windows. I didn't leave except to get water. My stomach was tight. I kept trying to convince myself I was just freaking out from the isolation. I even considered driving home early, but I didn't want to feel like I'd let my mind get the best of me. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I kept the lights off and sat in the living room with the knife in my hand. Around 3 a.m., I heard what sounded like a branch snapping. Not an animal sound, not the wind. I crept to the window and looked out. Nothing but blackness. Then I saw the shape. Just past the trees, maybe 30 or 40 feet from the cabin, there was a figure. Not moving, just standing. I could barely make out the outline, but it was definitely a person. I stood frozen for what felt like an hour. The figure didn't move. Eventually, I backed away from the window, locked the door again just to be sure, and sat in silence until the sun came up. When daylight finally broke, I went outside slowly, knife in hand. The figure was gone. I walked out to the trees where I thought it had been, and sure enough, there were boot prints in the dirt. Same size and shape as before. They led back into the woods right toward that faded trail. I made a decision then. I had to know what was going on. I couldn't just sit around waiting. I packed my bag, left most of my gear behind to travel light, and started down the trail with the knife on my belt and my flashlight in my hand. I walked for maybe 45 minutes, deeper than I had before. The forest got denser, the trees growing tighter together, branches low. Eventually, I reached a clearing. At the far edge of it, mostly hidden by brush, was a small structure. Not a cabin, more like a shack. Old, falling apart with a hole in the roof. I approached slowly. The door was hanging off the hinges. Inside was one small room. There was a rusty cot, a collapsed table, and shelves with old cans and plastic containers. A smell of rot and mold hung heavy. In the corner was a pile of clothing, dirty jackets, pants, boots. Too many for one person. There were also bones. Small animal bones, mostly, but they had been carefully stacked. Arranged, not randomly tossed. That detail stuck with me. I checked around the outside of the shack and saw fresh prints. Still damp from the night. Someone had been here recently. Very recently. I didn't stay long. Something in my gut told me to get out of there. I made my way back to the cabin fast, constantly checking behind me. When I got back, I packed everything. I didn't even stop to eat. I threw my bags in the car and started the engine. The tires spun a little in the dirt before grabbing, and I drove back down that rough road without stopping. As I reached the main road and finally saw pavement again, my chest loosened for the first time in 2 days. I didn't stop driving until I was over an hour away, back near a town with people and lights. I got a room in a roadside motel and passed out for 12 straight hours. The next day, I called the guy who gave me the cabin info. I told him everything. He went quiet and then admitted something he hadn't told me before. That part of the woods had a bad reputation. Over the years, hunters and hikers had reported strange sightings, signs of people living out there, off the grid, but nothing provable. He thought it was just old stories. Said his uncle never stayed out there himself, just kept the cabin on the property because it was cheap to maintain. I never went back. I didn't even want my security deposit. I couldn't shake the image of that figure in the woods, standing still in the dark, watching. Whoever that was, they weren't passing through. That shack, the clothing, the stacked bones. Someone was living out there, watching the cabin. I was 33 when I decided to take a break from everything and rent a cabin deep in the woods of northern Colorado. Work had been eating away at me, and my days felt like the same loop over and over. I wasn't trying to find myself or anything dramatic like that. I just wanted to be somewhere quiet, away from people, where I could think and maybe breathe a little better. I found the cabin on a listing site that focused on remote getaways, and this one seemed perfect. It was about 20 minutes down an unpaved road, no neighbors, surrounded by thick trees and nothing else. The pictures showed a plain wooden cabin with a porch, a small fire pit in the back, and a view of the tree-covered valley below. I packed up my truck with enough food for 10 days, a couple of changes of clothes, tools, and basic gear just in case something broke. I brought a small generator, my phone, a portable charger, a radio, and a few books. I didn't plan on using the internet or anything like that. The place had no service anyway, which was part of the appeal. I wanted quiet, real quiet. The drive out was long and slow, especially the last part. The gravel road had ruts and rocks that forced me to crawl forward at a snail's pace. I followed the directions the host gave me, watching for a blue marker on a tree that was supposed to indicate the turnoff. After about half an hour of winding through the woods, I spotted the tree and turned left onto a narrow dirt trail. Branches scraped the sides of the truck. The trail got tighter, but finally opened into a small clearing with the cabin sitting dead center. It looked older than the pictures made it seem. The wood siding was faded and weathered, with some boards warped slightly from years of sun and snow. There was a small shed next to it, padlocked, and a stack of old firewood behind that. The porch creaked under my boots as I walked up. I unlocked the front door with the key the host had left in a combination box by the steps and stepped inside. The cabin smelled like dust and dry wood. It was a single large room with a small kitchen along one wall, a sitting area with a couch and a low coffee table, a table with 2 chairs by the window, and a bed tucked into the back corner. There was a narrow bathroom, just a toilet and a shower with a tiny water heater mounted to the wall. Everything worked, even the old propane stove and the tiny refrigerator. I opened the windows to let the air flow in and started unpacking. The first day passed slowly. I sat on the porch as the sun went down, listening to the wind in the trees and the occasional chirp of some bird or the rustling of a small animal. There were no cars, no voices, no cell pings, just pure silence. I cooked a can of stew, read for a while, and went to bed early. The second day was the same, peaceful. I hiked a little, explored the area, didn't go too far, just far enough to get a feel for the place. I marked trees with red tape as I went, just to make sure I could find my way back without issue. The forest was thick, but beautiful. The air smelled clean, filled with pine and the dry scent of dirt and bark. I came across an old deer trail and followed it until it disappeared into thicker underbrush. I didn't see another person or hear a single man-made sound all day. On the third morning, I noticed something odd. When I stepped outside, there were boot prints in the dirt near the fire pit. I hadn't made them. I wore hiking shoes, and these were larger, heavier treaded prints. At first I thought maybe they were old, just brought out by the wind brushing off some of the topsoil. But they were fresh. The edges were clean, and the ground had been slightly damp from dew. I felt that little prick of awareness creep up the back of my neck, the way your body knows something before your brain can make sense of it. I looked around the clearing but saw nothing. No signs of anyone. No broken branches, no cigarette butts, no trash, nothing. I told myself it could have been someone passing through, maybe a hunter or hiker, but I didn't like it. I stayed outside most of that day, chopping firewood, keeping my ears open. I felt eyes on me more than once, though when I turned, there was nothing there, just trees and silence. That night, I double-checked the locks on the doors and windows. The front door had a deadbolt, and the windows had old latches, but I wedged sticks under each frame just to be sure. I pulled the curtains shut and kept a flashlight close. I left the generator off and used a battery lantern. The cabin made small sounds as it settled. Groans in the wood, creaks from the roof. Every time I heard something unfamiliar, my heart jumped a little. I barely slept. The next morning, the prints were gone, wiped clean, but something was wrong. One of the logs I had chopped and stacked near the back corner was missing. Just one. It made no sense. I circled the cabin slowly, checking everything. The shed lock was untouched. No signs of break-in, but one log gone didn't sit right with me. It wasn't like an animal could carry it off. It was too heavy, too awkward. It had to be a person. I kept the hatchet with me the whole day after that. I stayed close to the cabin, only going into the trees to grab more kindling. I kept checking behind me. There was always that quiet tension in the air, like something was holding its breath. I started thinking about how far out I really was. No cell service, no neighbors. No one would hear me if I screamed. That night, I sat in the dark with the lantern off, listening. Around midnight, I heard footsteps outside, slow, crunching the dirt and dead pine needles. They circled the cabin once, then stopped. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. I sat in the corner by the bed, the hatchet in my hand, my heartbeat thudding in my ears. After what felt like hours, the sound faded. I waited until dawn before moving. When light finally crept through the cracks in the curtains, I opened the front door and stepped out, careful, listening. The clearing was still, but nailed to the side of the cabin, just under the window, was the missing log. A hunting knife was jammed into it, just stuck in deep, left there. The knife was old and rusted, but the blade was still sharp. I pulled it out and held it. It didn't belong to me. That was the moment I knew this wasn't random. Someone was out there and they were watching me, playing with me. I needed to leave, but I also needed to be smart. I packed my things slowly, not rushing, not making it obvious. I put everything back in the truck, started the engine, and pulled away from the cabin without looking back. I made it halfway down the dirt trail before I saw the rope. It was stretched across the path, tied between two trees. A thick rope, the kind used for towing or climbing, positioned at chest height. If I had driven through it fast, it could have easily broken the windshield or worse. I stopped the truck and got out slowly. I looked around, heart pounding. Nothing. No one. Just trees. I cut the rope down with the old knife and drove on, this time much faster. I didn't stop until I hit the main road, and even then I didn't feel safe. I drove straight back into town, found the nearest motel, and checked in. I didn't tell anyone at the front desk what happened. I just wanted a bed, 4 walls, and a lock I trusted. The next morning, I reported the incident to the local sheriff. I told him everything I could remember, left out nothing. He listened carefully, nodded a lot, but in the end, all he said was that they'd send someone out to look. Probably a squatter or some survivalist. Said it happened sometimes in the deep woods. People who didn't want to be found. People who didn't like others in their territory. I never heard back. I never returned to the cabin. I left a review on the rental site but kept it vague. Said there were safety concerns and left it at that. I figured whoever was out there would still be there, and I didn't want anyone else to get the wrong idea and think the place was safe. It's been 2 years. I still think about it sometimes, usually when I'm in bed and the house is quiet. I still hear those footsteps in my memory, slow and steady outside the walls. I think about how close they came. I wonder what would have happened if I had stayed one more night. What was the plan? The knife in the log wasn't just a message, it was a warning. Or maybe it was an invitation. I don't go into the woods alone anymore. I don't rent remote cabins. I don't look for silence the way I used to. There's something out there, Not supernatural or cursed or any of that nonsense. Just something deeply human. Something dangerous and patient. I wasn't chosen. I was just unlucky enough to walk into their world. And next time, whoever does might not be as lucky as I was.